Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing live streams on various Christian topics. The current series is called The History of Judaism, and this is part 4. So let's go ahead and get started. So the title of today is From Abraham to Joseph, and just a little bit of a review from last week. So last week we did a deep dive into the idea of the Nephilim, which is a very strange, mysterious topic in the Bible. The word itself means the fallen ones, and that is a huge clue into who they are. We talked about how they could be humans in the line of Adam and Eve. And remember, Adam and Eve were very special insofar as they were created from scratch by God. We talked the week before that about how there were other humans outside of the garden, perhaps for, who knows, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, who knows. But at some point, God created this garden, and he created the man, and he put him in there. And then a little bit later, he created his wife and put her in there, and then we know they got kicked out of the garden. And at that point, they became the fallen ones because they had fallen from grace with God. So after they were removed from the Garden of Eden, they went ahead and had more children like Seth, and those children started to have children with the quote-unquote regular humans. They themselves were not regular humans. It seems like regular humans, like you and I, have shorter lifespans, and we're just in general pretty fragile creatures. The Nephilim had long lifespans, typically 10 times as long as the longest living humans. Remember, Lamech was the shortest. He died the earliest at 777 years young. So the Nephilim lived long lifespans, and hand in hand with that, they also appear to be much more robust anatomically, stronger, healthier, harder to kill, perhaps larger. That largeness could just be they were larger than regular humans because they didn't have problems with nutrition and malnutrition and things like that. Or there is a mythos, I'm not sure what the right word is, that they were giants, like 12 feet tall. The Bible doesn't say that. In fact, the idea that they were giants didn't come around until much later, till around the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, when the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, used the word gigantes, which means large. It also means robust and courageous warrior in the Greek language. And then, of course, it went on to be transliterated into English, and we use it for the word giant. So that's kind of where that all came around. So before that, they weren't considered giants. They were just considered stalwart humans, much more stalwart than regular humans. It's also possible that they were spiritually different, and that would be the main thing that this channel would want to look at. Only Adam and Eve were explicitly created in God's image. And that, in terms of my theological ideas, means that they were capable of holding the Spirit of God. In fact, Adam and Eve did have the Spirit of God breathed into them, but then they lost it when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and were expelled from the garden so that they wouldn't eat from the tree of life and live forever. So if the idea is that Adam and Eve are the parents or the ancestors of all human beings, then of course all human beings would then be created in God's image. But if Adam and Eve were special human beings, and it appears they were, then besides being the fallen ones and being associated with the physical attributes that other humans could see and be in awe of, they also had this spiritual aspect that they were capable of holding the Spirit of God. If that were the case, it would be important that that aspect of their composition, that trait, that I don't know if it's genetic trait or what, but that particular trait needs to be maintained throughout history. And that's precisely what we see with God, for instance, selecting Enoch at the young age of, I think, 365. He went up to be with God in heaven. But then we also see that with Noah. So Noah traces his ancestry back to Adam, and that is one of the reasons why he was chosen. There were probably lots of people on the planet that were, at that point, were Nephilim, who were related to the line of Adam, the fallen ones. But God says that Noah found favor. That's a good summary of last week. Today, we're going to skip ahead from Noah all the way to Abraham, and we'll talk about Abraham all the way up to Joseph. What are we skipping when we go from Noah to Abraham? Well, we're skipping the flood account, and we're also skipping what I believe is an important story, the Tower of Babel. So I'll just say something quickly about those two things up front. I put the flood is the largest supernatural intervention attributed to God in Genesis. But did it actually happen? That question could fill a series of its own, and perhaps I will do that in the future. Now, there are a lot of ancient flood traditions, and they're widespread throughout just about every civilization that's out there. And scholars debate their historical mechanisms, if they were caused by melting ice caps or melting glaciers from the Ice Age, or perhaps a comet or something like that, or a land bridge breaking. In the Hebrew scriptures, the flood primarily functions as a theological reset. So it's a turning point that precedes this covenant history and this nation of Israel and the religion itself, Judaism, that would come from it. Now, if we follow Adam's lineage in Genesis, the flood would occur, and we use these numbers, if we were to use these numbers literally, about their age and when they had children, the flood would occur at 1,656 years after the creation of Adam and Eve. Now, I don't believe that's the same time as when the universe was created. It's what we went through in episode 1. And so I don't believe in the young, or don't subscribe to the young earth idea. But I do believe that there's a young Adam and Eve idea, or young Nephilim idea, that those relatively recently in our history as humans, God chose to create a man and a woman as adults and put them in this special garden. If you work backwards from anchor points, like times that we know absolute dates more accurately, from things like the Exodus or the various exiles that happened to Israel, many scholars place the flood at approximately 2,350 BC. Now that may sound like a long time ago. That's 4,300 years ago. But that's actually very near. Certainly from a geological perspective, that's a very recent event. But even in human history, that's a pretty recent event. And a worldwide flood covering the highest mountains would be expected, at least from a human standpoint, to leave unmistakable evidence. If by natural means, you'd think that if there was a flood as recent as that's flooded the whole earth as recently as 4,300 years ago, you would think that there'd be all kinds of evidence of that flood. The other thing is that if everybody of all humanity except for 8 people were drowned by that flood, then those 8 people it would be up to them to repopulate the earth. And could that be done? Could it go from 8, when really 6, because Noah was already pretty old, so was his wife. So for those 6 people, his 3 sons and their 3 wives, and their wives, to go from those 6 to 8 billion people spread across every continent. So it's very difficult to think of those things in in a real sense if we take all those numbers from the book of Genesis literally. So what are we to make of it? And what I see the Bible really doing in the creation story, as well as all the various stories we've talked about with Adam and Eve and with now the flood. So what I see is the Bible interpreting historical events through the lens of God, the Hebrew God, the monotheistic Hebrew God. So you see their civilizations like the Sumerians would have had their own creation story and their own flood account. They do have their own creation story and their own flood account. But then those accounts are now reinterpreted through the eyes of the Hebrew God. What that means then, and this is kind of the focus, one of the focuses of this series, is that it's the supernatural interventions of God. God clearly was supernaturally intervening in the history of humankind. So that means that God could have flooded the earth, in a way that didn't leave, the type of evidence that we would expect, or it could have been a massive but regional event, or maybe the genealogical ages that are given in the Bible are condensed, so it's actually a much greater length of time. So I don't have definitive answers for those things, but what I do say is what matters the most, especially for the purpose of this series, that Genesis chapter 2 through 6 distinguishes God's special line of humans from the rest of humanity. And that framework allows us to focus on what I believe is the central point, that God created a distinct people, and through repeated supernatural interventions, preserved that line throughout history, ultimately leading to Abraham and beyond. Just quickly with the Tower of Babel, this is another supernatural intervention in Genesis that redirects the course of human history. God allows human civilizations nowadays and since then to build impressive cities and impressive towers later on. So the issue that happened at Babel doesn't seem to be, the message that we should get out of it is that towers are evil, or even that towers built to show the awesomeness of humanity are evil. It seems more like Babel was just too early, that it was a premature consolidation and unity organization of humanity that in God's view, especially his future prophetic view, he could see that could spiral and derail humanity yet again into corruption and evilness and rebellion. Now, some scholars think that Moses is offering an origin story for the world's many distinct languages, and that could be part of what's going on. But the text itself just emphasizes that God is confusing their language to prevent a unified humanity from accelerating without restraint from a civilizational perspective. And then he scatters them across the earth. So that's another example. All right, let's go ahead and get into today's slides. Okay, so the first question we have to ask is, why did God choose Abram? Of course, and he gets renamed to Abraham. So if we look at Genesis 11, chapter 11, verse 10 through Genesis 12, verse 9, in the first part of that, the verses 10 through 32, we see the post-flood lineage from Shem all the way to Abram. So the Bible continues to go in a single line, choosing just one of a person's sons. And in a lot of cases, or in most cases, it doesn't say why he's choosing them. We know that God is able to look down into the future, or look into the future, and see what will happen if he chooses one person over another. And so that seems to be the kind of the driving factor. Other than that, it's limited to Adam and Eve, whom he very specifically created. So he chooses Shem, and then you can go through the lineage and you can get all the way to Abram. And then since Noah's line, so Noah was Shem's father, goes all the way back to Adam, that would indicate that Noah's kids either repopulate the whole earth or at least that region. And then all of the individuals in that region or on the whole earth then could trace their lineage back to Noah, and therefore they would be candidates for the promise that God is about to make, that we're going to see the promise that he makes with Abraham. Going along this idea that there's something special about the Adam and Eve and their descendants, then when God chooses to choose the person who will be the father of the nation that he's going to create in order to send the Messiah, that person would have to be in that lineage. Now, there'd be a lot of people on earth that are in that lineage at that time, but God chooses Abraham. When he chose Noah, he said that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So that's not too much information, but at least, it says Noah, something about Noah. He found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So he doesn't usually give long explanations. I don't know if he gives long explanations about anybody in particular, but I think we can deduce why God chose one person or another by what happens afterwards. So in the case of Noah, we see that he takes God seriously. He believes in God. He has faith in God. God tells him to build an ark, and he does. So here it's very similar with Abraham, or Abram is how he starts. I think it has to do with Abram's ability to obey God. So in verse 4 of chapter 12, it says, "So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with them." Abram would only only obey God if he believed that God was who he said he was. And so we see there's the faith aspect as well. Later on, we see that Abram was willing to obey to the extent of sacrificing his only son. Now, that was a much more common practice back then in the pagan religions. It's terrible, but it was a common practice for people to sacrifice their children. So it wouldn't be exactly the same ask today, if it was today versus back then, but still, very difficult task. And Abram was willing to do that because he believed in God. He believed God was who he said he was. Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19, it says that Abram had such incredible faith to the extent that he thought that God, if he had gone through with it and sacrificed Isaac, that God would be able to raise him back to life, because he could reason that if God's going to make a nation out of him, then obviously he has to have at least one kid. In fact, we know the story, he didn't have to sacrifice his son, but he was willing to. In verses 2 and 3 of Genesis chapter 12, that is where we see God's first promise to Abram, that he will make him into a great nation, he will bless him, he'll even bless those who bless him, and curse those who curse him. So he will protect them and even bless those countries that bless him. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. I think that's the best part, as someone who is one of those people throughout all the earth and throughout time. The fact that God was going to bless the whole earth through what was going to be done through the nation that he would start from Abram. And in verses 5 through 9, we see that Abram travels through what will become the promised land. And we see that Lot is with him. And I kind of thought to myself as I was researching this, was Lot even supposed to go? Because it just kind of says that his nephew Lot went with him. So it never says in the Bible that he wasn't supposed to go. But I do think from a narrative standpoint, if you read the story, Lot wasn't supposed to go with him, and that him being there made things more difficult. And for sure, though, we know that the intended promise line, ancestral line, was not going to go through Lot or have anything to do with Lot. We're going to cover a lot from Genesis 12 all the way to chapter 50 today. So obviously it can't go verse by verse or even section by section. But the lens I want to use to go through these various important people along this ancestral line of Judaism is I want to look at focus on the promises that God made to them and the miracles, another word is the supernatural interventions that God did to them. So here are the promises that God gives to Abram, and who God will rename as Abraham, the father of nations. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. You will be a blessing to all the families or peoples of the earth. I will bless those who bless you and judge those who curse you. I will give your descendants this land, which was the land of Canaan. And there's a long list of all the various people who were living there. Your offspring will be as numerous as the stars. That's Genesis chapter 15. Your heir will come from your own body. So it won't be from some handmaiden or something. It will be from himself. I will give you the land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. So that's much larger than modern day Israel. And later on in the series, this is already part 4. I believe this will be an 8-part series. Later on, we will talk about this idea of what about modern Israel and if these same blessings extend all the way to now, but not in this episode. Okay, so I will establish an everlasting covenant with you and your descendants. You will be the father of many nations, and kings will come from you. So those are a synopsis or a summary of the promises that God gives to Abram over his life. Now, there's lots of supernatural events. Here's the ones that I chose. So he gets this call from Ur, that's where his family is from, and God directs him to leave everything. And that's a divine appearance. Somehow God, I don't know if it was in his mind or if he showed up as an angel or a burning bush. I don't know how he did it, but somehow he appeared to Abraham, and Abraham knew that this was God. So then there's lots of divine appearances after this that reaffirm the promise, and he explicitly reaffirms the promise, and that you can see that in Genesis chapters 15 and 17, in addition to chapter 12. Then this covenant ceremony, let's look at that in particular, because that has some implications. I won't read the whole passage, but in verse 8 of chapter 15, it says, "But Abram said, 'Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain and take possession of it?'" That being the land, the promised land. So the Lord tells him to bring him a heifer, a goat, and a ram, 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. So 5 different animals. Abraham brings those and cuts them in two and arranges the halves opposite of each other. This would be very weird nowadays if we did this. If somebody said, "Hey, let's go into business together, and we're going to have some rules that we're going to establish for this business to succeed. Let's cut some animals in half." No, we don't do that nowadays. It's more about credit checks and contracts, long legalese contracts. Back then, though, it was about cutting animals in half and walking between them. But in verse 17, it says, "When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, 'To your descendants I will give this land.'" And then he describes this whole area from the great river of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates. God does this on his own because he is Abraham himself was put into a deep sleep. This places the covenant's ultimate fulfillment on God himself. So we're also going to talk a little bit, as we talk about covenants, we're going to talk about conditions, because covenants typically have 2 sides to them, or more than one side, 2 or more sides. Let's say it that way. Covenants typically have 2 or more sides, and those sides have to all heed the contract. Otherwise, the covenant is null and void. Ancient Near East, animals were cut in half and the covenant parties passed between the pieces. The symbolic meaning was, this may be done to me if I break the covenant. So you get cut in half. So the only commitment we see from Abraham is circumcision. That's in Genesis 17:10. And I put here that circumcision wasn't unheard of in the Near East, but Genesis 17 uniquely makes it as a sign of this covenant that's applied to every male in Abraham's household, and that it's done on the 8th day by the parent. So it's definitely not something that the child is deciding, but it's the parent saying that I will raise this child in this covenant with God. Here are some other miracles that God did with Abraham. He got protection from Sarai in Egypt and by these kings that may have wanted to kill him, and they may have very well wanted to kill him, but they didn't, partly because he said she was a sister, but then God miraculously intervened. Of course, there's the miraculous conception of Isaac to someone who had been barren and also was an old, both of them were in old age, Abraham and Sarah. You see the judgment of Sodom after Abram's intercession, and you see the provision of the ram at Moriah. So in the region of Moriah, Genesis chapter 22, that is where God provides the sacrifice. And now we know that the temple, that's the first temple that was built by Solomon, as well as the second temple. But the first temple was built in the same area as Abraham's sacrifice. That is the region of Moriah, or the mountains of Moriah. Now the Jews at that time maintained that the altar of the temple itself was at that precise spot. Now some Christians also believe that this location would be the future site of Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified and God sacrificed his son. And both places are possible because of the fact that it uses kind of this general terminology of Moriah. Golgotha was about 1/3 to 1/2 a mile from the temple altar. So they weren't certainly in the same place, but they were kind of close together. It wouldn't be right to say that Golgotha was on Mount Moriah, the actual mountain which is called Moriah, which is the Temple Mount. But it was close enough to the temple for the symbolism to be unavoidable. And Jesus and those who were there at the crucifixion could see the temple beyond the wall at Golgotha. Go to Isaac, his son. So here are the promises that Isaac gets. This is Genesis chapter 23 through 26. I will bless you, and I will be with you. I will give you and your descendants all these lands. I will establish the oath I swore to Abraham. I will multiply your offspring like the stars of heaven. In your seed, all nations will be blessed. I will keep this covenant because of Abraham's obedience. So you can see there that why God chose Abraham and why God made this kind of unconditional covenant with Abraham, just the only condition being circumcision. But it was because of Abraham's obedience and his faith. And your descendants will inherit this land. Now, the supernatural things that God did to Isaac was a little bit, I would say, a little less than what he did with Abraham, and even a little less than some of the future people that are going to be in this line. But he was a miraculous birth to elderly parents. He was substituted as a sacrifice. He wasn't the sacrifice of Moriah. Instead, it was the ram that God provided. There was a divine reaffirmation during the famine, told not to go to Egypt at that time. There was protection in Gerar despite this deception that was going on with his sister. Extraordinary agricultural blessing reaped 100-fold in the time of a famine. Repeated divine appearances and reassurances. There was the womb that was opened up for Rebekah after her barrenness, and there was an oracle given before the birth of the twins that the older shall serve the younger, which is different than would have normally happened in that case. And then this idea that the preservation of the covenant line through Jacob, who was the younger. Promises, again, we're talking about this lens of idea of looking at promises and miracles. Now we're looking at Jacob, who is then renamed to Israel, which means struggles with God. Because he struggled with God, he kind of had a little wrestling match with God, and he lost. Okay, so this is Genesis 27 through 35. God promises Jacob that on the land on which you lie, you will be given to you in the sense. You'll see that a lot of these promises are very similar to the ones from the fathers, because God is reassuring that this is happening. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. You will spread out to the west, east, north, and south. You and your seed, all in you and your seed, all families on earth shall be blessed. I am with you and will keep keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, because he knows that in time he will leave the land, but I'll bring him back. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your body. Here's a summary of some of the supernatural things, interventions that God did for Jacob. So there was this oracle before his birth we just talked about. There was this vision that he had at Bethel about this ladder and the stairway and angels ascending and descending, and this wrestling match they had. And so the covenant is reaffirmed there. So then you have divine protection during his flight from Esau, because his brother wasn't so happy about this whole thing. He appears in a dream to Laban to prevent harm. Angel of God instructs Jacob regarding his flocks, about which ones to choose. Of course, we talked about this wrestling encounter. His name was changed to Israel. Esau's softened heart, and reconciliation later on instead of slaughter. Divine reaffirmation at Bethel. That covenant is renewed and confirmed. And of course, there's repeated instances of God opening and closing wombs among his wives. Okay, so there's a big change that happens now, because Jacob, or Israel, has 12 sons. This is Genesis 37 through 50. And before this, you can take a single line all the way from Adam to Jacob. But it's here that it starts to spread, because you can't start a nation with just one person, right? And one family. So here's where it starts to spread. It goes to 12. Nevertheless, though, there's still, at this time, a chosen line, and that is Joseph. But we will also see that there's a chosen line, which is where the Messiah comes, and that is from Judah. So Joseph becomes the instrument of God to move that structure into Egypt. So they need to move from the promised land to Egypt for a certain period of time, several centuries, which is it's a long time. Now, God uses Egypt's protection, and I put through separation because the Egyptians don't want to be around them, because they're herders, shepherds, which was, I guess, bad to them. And so they put him in the land of Goshen. So they were separated. They were still, though, under the protection of Egypt's army. And then, ironically, later on, they become slaves and are exploited. But all that ensures that they will grow to be the nation of Israel. So you could sort of see this period of 400 years as a incubation period, or a gestation period. And then I put Judah as the line that comes through the Messiah. So following Joseph, Genesis 37 through 50, that's the end of the book, I put to start with divine direction. He has these prophetic dreams that announce his future elevation that his family doesn't like so very much, and so he's sold into Egypt. But that betrayal is what is the impetus for how he gets to Egypt. And the Lord was with Joseph when he was in Potiphar's house, and he was being accused of trying to be with his wife when he wasn't. It was the other way around. That false accusation, it puts him in prison, but even then, that's part of the plan. Later on, it does take some time. He has to be in this prison. Things don't look so great for this nation. But then Pharaoh has these dreams, and those two people remember, or one of them, whoever was alive still, is elevated to power. Joseph gets elevated to power. And then because of that, this famine is foreseen, because Joseph is able to interpret the dreams that God gave to Pharaoh. And they're able to administratively prepare for it by having silos and storage places that store the seeds. The brothers' guilt is exposed, and their repentance is tested. This thing about them coming and them not recognizing Joseph, and Joseph has to leave and cry, and then he comes back in the room. Ultimately, the whole family is relocated to Egypt for preservation. So what looked like chaos turned into a coordinated providence from God. Joseph advances the future nation. So this preserves this family, his covenant family, so the father and the 12 sons, from this famine, which was a terrible famine of that time. They're in Egypt and they settle in Goshen. It's a separate region from the Egyptians, but it's a fertile region, so they're happy to have it. Establishes Israel as a distinct people group. So because they were separate, they didn't intermarry with the Egyptians. You could say the other way around. The Egyptians didn't want to marry with them. But that was, again, all part of God's plan. And this idea that God will surely visit you, and the promise of Jacob returning to the land is carried out by his bones being brought back to the land. And that's when the Exodus starts. Put here that Egypt did benefit from Joseph. First, in the short term, he forecasted this famine that was about to happen, and he was also put in charge of the preparations for that famine, and he did a great job. And because of that, Egypt and the fledgling Israel was able to survive this famine, and they even became a regional grain supplier. And then because of that, Pharaoh's house gained an extremely capable administrator that Joseph was. Joseph was a very responsible person, but it goes along the lines of blessing those who bless them and cursing those who curse them. So initially, the relationship between Israel and Egypt was a good one. But we know that long term, that wasn't the case. So for a long period after Joseph, Israel contributed economically, labor, productivity, population growth to Egypt. But then we see that in Exodus 1, that flips the framing, and Egypt then starts, because Israel's gotten too big. So it's like a birth, really, that when the baby gets too big from gestation, then the baby has to come out. And so that's what happens here. Israel has to come out of Egypt, and the setup for that is that Egypt exploits and enslaves Israel. And then, of course, there's this catastrophic judgment. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed that. I'm going on vacation. And so for the next 3 Sundays, I will be on vacation March 22nd. So that will be the next live stream that I'll do, March 22nd. So I hope you enjoyed this episode as we talked about Abraham all the way to Joseph. And when we get back together in several weeks, then we will continue on as the Exodus brings Israel out of Egypt. First, they have to wander around in the desert for a little bit, but then they finally do take the promised land by force. So have a great evening. Remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends.